I went into finance because, like everyone who went to Princeton or an Ivy League school at that time, and still that was the thing that you were told to do. You were either going to go into investment banking or consulting, which, by the way, are really good training grounds for fundamental skills. But one should question, why do you have so many smart people funneling into specific roles? No one's saying it's your job to go teach, but things bloom and good people, I guess, make kind of interesting decisions around values and philosophy too. I think there's a lot of really highly technical people who arguably have extremely high IQ, but can't put a lot of pieces together commercially. If I were to look back rationally, I probably left Instacart too early. I was probably too impatient. I don't think the role I was outgrowing, but I didn't feel I had champions at Instacart.
What's going on? This is actually one of my favorite episodes that we've done yet. It's a conversation with my dear friend, Sophia Deng. Sophia was an early employee at Instacart, Ramp, Remote.com, and a few other startups. She's a founder today, and she's just one of the most interesting thinkers and builders that I know. She's got a ton of really interesting stories and experiences from her time at these companies. And we talked about that. We talked about what makes the founders of Ramp specifically really great. And we just had a lot of like back and forth and debate really over just everything that we both have learned and observed that is maybe not obvious from being inside of these companies and what like makes them work, the dynamics, just things that go on inside of an early stage or like fast growing company that you don't really appreciate if you've never been inside of one. So it was a really great episode. A lot of like hot takes, a lot of conversations you don't normally get to have with people. So I'm excited about this one. I personally enjoyed recording it a lot, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm going to give you an intro. So, Sophia, you went to high school at Montgomery Blair High School in Maryland. Then you did philosophy at Princeton. That's an interesting thing to major in. You were an M&A banker at Citi for a little bit. Got to get to the finance bro pedigree. And then you were in product at Instacart in 2015, which was pretty early at Instacart. And then you've basically been early at like a bunch of other startups since then. You were director of ops plus product at Gigster, which is like an interesting company that we're going to talk more about later. Head of biz ops at Ramp, which is like super early. Ramp wasn't even publicly launched yet when you joined. Mm-hmm. And then Remote, which is in the same space as like Deal and a bunch of other folks. You were a product manager there. And now you are a founder at a consumer AI company, and we're going to talk more about that later. And then I met you through kind of randomly, actually, through a friend when you were in the early stages of figuring out what you were going to do post working in startups and doing your own thing. So I think what's just like so interesting about your background is that you worked in a lot of startups before becoming a founder.
Yeah.
And so I think like that operator experience is really interesting to dig into, which we're going to do. But also I think you can speak to the perspective of coming out of that into being a founder in a way that I think a lot of people can't. So I think there's going to be a lot of good stuff to talk about there. And I just think you're cool. So that just makes this more fun. My first question and then you can like tell me if I got anything wrong on the intro, but why was being a philosophy major one of the best decisions of your life?
First of all, thank you for even thinking I should chat with you. I'm very flattered, and maybe some of the stories I have at startups I've been at and insights can be helpful to anyone listening. Being a philosophy major was life-changing for multiple reasons, and I still think it's probably one of the biggest, not just the best decisions of my life, but the most foundational decisions I've made. First, it was about independence. So aside from just philosophy as a major, it was the first time I really felt that I made a very independent decision on my own. And as a child of Asian immigrants, that is very difficult because you often feel the burden when you grow up of doing what your parents tell you to do. They've made so many sacrifices coming to this country. They want you to become an engineer, a doctor for financial stability. And here I am wanting to be a philosophy major is insane. Like, they did not immigrate to this country for me to do that. And so the first reason is just because of this sort of deep personal desire that I had to be myself and go against what I was told, yet have the gumption to say, no, this is what I'll do. But the more important reason I would say is what philosophy teaches you is fundamentally about how to think about the world and how to understand the world. being a philosophy major is almost, I would argue, like taking acid, but without acid, or meditating without meditating. And you get to break down like the world and the components of it with such clarity that everything after, like even things like doing product or trying to start a company, you just see the different pieces very, very clearly and are able to think from first principles. So those are the two main reasons. One, very identity related, but the second is I think it is probably one of the most arguably useful majors that you could actually major in.
Yes, I think my one caveat, this is just personal opinion that I'm going to add there. If you're like the kind of entrepreneurial person who has a lot of agency, I think that's true. If you just want to like anybody I know that did that pathway, which is maybe like the minority, but didn't want to be more entrepreneurial, I don't think that's helpful to you at all. Like if you don't want to have a lot of agency over your life, it's not probably going to be the most helpful thing you can do. If you are one of those like super high agency people, it's probably one of the highest leverage things you can do.
Totally.
Yeah, so double clicking maybe on the identity part, it seems like to me, maybe I'm wrong, but from what I can gather on like really trying to find anything I could about you on the internet in preparation for this, you seemed like you were into tech pretty early on too. So like, why did you decide to go into finance before going into startups?
I went into finance because like everyone who went to Princeton or an Ivy League school at that time, and still that was the thing that you were told to do. You were either going to go into investment banking or consulting, which, by the way, are really good training grounds for fundamental skills. But one should question, why do you have so many smart people funneling into specific roles? The other side of that is I didn't have the personal confidence to feel like I could jump into technology. I had a gut feeling that is what I was attracted to. In fact, my senior thesis as a philosophy major was about the internet. So this is not like, oh, all of a sudden, as you mentioned, I am interested in startups. It was brewing for a very long time. Just, I think from a personality standpoint, I've always been very attracted to innovation and changing things up. Like, this is the most philosophy major thing to say, but I have always been interested to question why the world is the way it is. And the tech industry is just full of that sort of sentiment. And so I knew kind of in my heart, this was what I would like to be around, but I didn't have the personal confidence and I didn't really know a pathway in college. And I know that sounds weird, but I didn't know what YC was in college. There was very low tech people at Princeton, believe it or not, when I was there. It's not like Stanford or Berkeley, where everyone from day one just starts the company and pitches their professors. It's actually way more East Coast traditional. So that's why I ended up doing banking. And I have no regrets because it gave me more conviction that it was totally not the right place for me. That's more the reason.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I also think the context is important in that it really feels to me it's only been like the last maybe 5 or 6 years to where like startups have become so mainstream that it's like permeated everything to where like almost anyone has been exposed to it that went to like a reasonably decent school in some capacity. I think that's like a new thing. And so this is like
quite new.
Like 20, yeah. So like 10 years ago, I don't think outside of those couple schools, I don't think that was a thing that most people were thinking about. So you go do the traditional thing. You double click it. Okay, this is not right for me.
No,
and then something has to happen after that. So how did you go from that place to ending up at Instacart?
I knew it was not the place for me because I looked around the investment bank I was at. And by the way, there are people there who mentored me, who I still think so highly of. But there were so many people higher up that I looked around and I thought, this is not who I want to be, or this is not who I admire or resonate with at all. And is this really like what I'm going to be doing for the next years? So I was probably the only or one of the only people in my class at Citi to not recruit even for the next step, which is hedge funds or private equity. And instead I was sitting in my cubicle, pretty obsessed with tech, reading at that time Kara Swisher's blog, allthingsd.com. And this is a precursor to Recode. And like, I just thought, I guess it was pretty natural. I was just like, hey, I guess I'm like reading this blog all the time, looking at funding news. Now I know what Y Combinator is. If I'm naturally doing this, I think I should just try. And I called up my friend from Princeton, the only person I knew who was in tech, and he's originally from the Bay Area. His name is Taylor Francis. And I said, hey, I think I want to do this tech thing. Do you have any suggestions of how I should like go about it? Because I have no idea. He said, first, you need to go to San Francisco. Like you straight up just need to move. And I said, okay, I hear you. I will do that. And second, this is what's crazy. He said, I'm going to be joining this company called Stripe in a month or so. And by the way, Stripe was 150 people at that time. He said, do you want to like consider an interview? And I said, yeah, I got back to him later. I was like, maybe not. And the reason why was because I didn't know what an API was. I didn't know what payments was. And I was afraid of embarrassing him. So I went back to him and said, I don't know, like this Stripe thing. And I said, what about other companies? And he said, what about this company called Instacart? I think it's doing well. It's very promising. And I said, well, I understand that one because it's grocery delivery. I don't know if I believe in grocery delivery, but I understand what groceries are. So I'm going to find my way, because this is what Taylor said, and Taylor knows a lot. I'm going to find any way to get into this company. And so that is my story, actually, of how I got into Instacart. And I emailed almost anyone whose email I could find online multiple times. And I got the lowest probably position, one of the lowest positions that Instacart offered to get my foot in the door. So
Wait,
it's
so
quite
what was the
random
position?
and a little bit lucky because Taylor is so ingrained in the Bay Area culture and had also been searching for startups to join himself.
Interesting. So what position? What did you join at initially?
Maybe you could argue it wasn't like the lowest position, but it was an operations role to essentially QA the logistics and delivery algorithms. Engineers would be creating, the algorithms to match the orders to the shoppers and drivers. But because the company was so early, there were a lot of problems, a lot of things not taken account for. For example, like driving in New York is very different and actually needs certain specificity than like San Francisco and lots of different things, based on supply and demand. And so there was a new team that was in operations, basically to monitor almost like a internal support person, these algorithms and like suggest ideas to the engineers for how to improve them. So it was like essentially like an ops QA role.
Interesting. Okay. So there's so much to double click on there. So one, just the amount of hustle to actually get in the door there. I'm going to come back to that in a second, but while we're on like this job you took, like I got to imagine going from like Princeton banking, you had like a very high status, like great career trajectory. And you're just like, nah, actually San Francisco. And I'm going to take this like low level ops job. I got to imagine that was hard. It seems like you had conviction in it, but that must have been, from at least a social perspective, that had to have been a hard decision to make.
It was very hard because, as I mentioned before, friends of mine from college were all on a path around finance and consulting, and those are a specific amount of money. So first you're giving that up and like that status. Then there's like no understanding of, even for me, of like what this role was. But I felt so deeply in my gut that this was the industry that I wanted to be at, that I was willing to take a chance. It is very lucky that Instacart worked out the way it did, because I may be telling a different story if it were a startup that actually did not have very much success. But at that time, it felt like it was not even Instacart was doing so well or whatever, but it felt like I needed personally to get my foot in the door to this industry that I had like, I could see myself really loving.
Yeah. Wow. So it didn't seem like Instacart was guaranteed to be a success. If you just needed the foot in the door, like, why do you think it mattered whether or not that was a success for everything else that happened in your career after that?
It's a really good question. I think it's not talked about enough that actually, if you were to pick, Elad Gil talks a little bit about this, you really should try to pick a company that's going to be successful for your first one. I didn't know this. Just to be clear, I didn't know what YC was until I was reading All Things D and at my investment banking job. But looking back, if I were to tell myself, I would have told Sophia, thank effing God this one worked out. And like, you should be picking the first company, especially if you're jumping industries, whether it's tech or anything, but especially startups. Really, ideally, you want to hit a good one because a few things. Unfairly, you get a halo effect from just being that company. Even if you didn't do squat, you are perceived as being higher value. Like, I hope, I actually contributed to Instacart, but I probably thereon, after even like Gigster, Ramp, Remote, having Instacart and then Instacart IPOing, like on my resume did not hurt me. It definitely helped me only, even if I did not do very much there. So that's like just one strategic reason. The other is that internally at good companies, like if they're growing quite fast, you just have good people and you get to learn from people who are just more excellent than you are. And it's a wonderful place for a young person because you're just able to talk to anyone or just read their documentation, look at their notes, look at their artifacts, like their specs, and learn from that. And if you're at a company that just isn't growing as much, isn't as successful, it's hard to tell what you learn, like you learn what not to do a lot of times, but the better thing is to pair learning what not to do with learning what excellence looks like. And then finally, and this I totally discounted, and you may actually resonate with this because one of the companies you worked at has a lot of alumni founders, is the alumni network for a successful company becomes very strong. Like I ended up starting the Instacart alumni Slack community, and it only grows, first of all, because more people leave, but the amount of people helping each other out is very, very high. And it's just because there's affinity of working together. Now, a lot of people have not even worked together at the same time at that company. And it is such an advantage.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's almost like going to school. It's like if you go to a good school, you build like that alumni network. If like you go to Harvard and like that other person you just reached out to on LinkedIn that went there 20 years ago, the fact that you both went to Harvard gives like that immediate connection. And I actually think in startups, it's almost like the same thing. Like I had a extremely uncredentialed start to my life and career. And like no one's ever heard of the school I went to. No one, like none of those things were ever helpful to me. But I joined a startup called On Deck early, and it wasn't even that successful, but it like made a big splash at the time, and it won for a little bit, enough to where like that helped me build a great network of other alumni. One, a great network of people that were in the specific communities we built, and then even just the fact that I was there helped me get my career off the ground. And it's still been helpful to this day. Like we meet customers, investors, whatever, just through that general network. And yeah, I think people don't miss how much like, it's almost like picking a school to go to. You should almost like look at it in a very similar regard to like, when I go to this place, like it almost doesn't matter how cool it is. If you think there's really smart people there, that alumni network alone can be valuable, even if the company doesn't work out to the degree that you think it might or want it to.
Yeah, I actually think picking matters quite a lot. It's not easy, but it's underrated because a lot of times people are so focused on title or compensation that you realize those things matter much less if you are to stay in the startup ecosystem and even potentially become a founder.
Totally. So on that point, so you join in this like whatever job you could get, you hustle it. Yes. Like what happens after that? Because eventually I know you ended up doing product, but it's like when people are actually at these companies, it's like you have 8 jobs and at some point you just like throw the title you had the longest on there and then you move on to your next thing. So I'm kind of curious, like what different things did you do from beginning to end at Instacart?
Yeah, so I was doing that operations role, but very quickly, and this was very interesting about the team I was on, the manager was able to hire vastly overqualified people for what we were doing. So all of us were a little bit discontented, to be honest, with the role we had. And my first I guess, inkling was I kind of want to automate myself out of this because I don't think we need to be working on this. Like, I think it doesn't need this much human intervention, this much human monitoring. And so I started learning SQL because that was just one thing that seemed to be, whenever I talked to the data scientists and engineers that I was like paired with, they were often in SQL and they were often kind of like talking about decisions with different metrics. And so I was like, okay, if they're doing that, I'm going to start learning SQL. So on my own, I started learning SQL and I started just like writing SQL queries for them or for other people, like around the topic that I was engaged in, just to be clear. And it's a very wide topic. It's about like delivery times, batching, number of shoppers. So it's very, very wide. It's the whole logistics algorithm around supply and demand matching. And it just seemed like, I guess, that I was becoming helpful to people. I developed a relationship with the lead PM of that team that was on the logistics engineering side. And he took me under his wing because I was just like writing more SQL queries. I was like, hey, can I write a doc for you or try? It was this sort of putting in more hours though. It really wasn't an easy transition. At that time, I didn't know about product. I didn't think it was an elevated role or anything, just to be clear. But I felt like I could offer more than the role I was hired into. And I just thought, let me try to be like helpful to people and like do the things that they don't want to do or do the things that they don't have time to. And that was the stepping stone. Like I would do my job and it was like a lot. And then on the side, I would do all these other things like write different queries, write little business analyses, and then start making my way to writing specs. And I was very lucky that someone at Instacart took me under his wing and was like, okay, I guess you're pretty proactive. So maybe you can do more product stuff officially.
Wow. Interesting. I feel like this is one of the things that people also miss too. Like if you want to work in startups and then you get a chance like you did and you want to turn that chance into more, it's not like you really have to prove to people, like you have to do extra things. Like I actually forgot about this, but it's like, I'm thinking now about like, why did I get promoted here and there at this one company? And it's like, it's actually, most of it had nothing to do with the job I was hired into. I think people miss that. It's like, there's like a million fires at any company that's even remotely working. And if you just like do your job well and then also find yourself being helpful in these other areas, you build relationships across the company. And you are like helpful, you're building other skills. And so whenever there is an opportunity to do something else besides what you're currently doing, there's a good chance they might think of you for that. But if you just like sit there in your siloed role, if you, Sophia, had sat there in that siloed role and like just doing like ops Q&A, you might not have ever left if that is like all you would ever do.
Totally. And I think the other mistake I see people do more and more is, oh, I want to be a product manager. So what's the next step? Like, tell me what exactly I need to do. And I just haven't seen that work out in every company I've been at. When people progress or change different roles, they often are creating value through themselves. They're not like waiting for someone to say, this is the path. Because by the way, that person doesn't know what the path is either. Like they have a lot of work to do. And it also is a little presumptuous to say, it's time for me to be a product manager. I'm going to just do these things and then like you'll promote me or allow me for a change. It just doesn't really naturally work that way from my experience.
Yeah, totally. And I actually think on that point too, it's like, I don't even remember like some of the titles I've had at different startups I've been at were at the time. I mean, you've had much more experience in this than I have for sure, but it's like half the time, the thing that you're going to be remembered for is more like almost like being at the company a lot of times. And it's going to be the whatever title it is you held itself. But it's easy to miss that in the moment because you're like trained to like, oh, I need to be a head of this or I need to be a product manager or whatever. Like you're so caught up into it in the moment because it feels so important. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, it doesn't matter at all. It just matters that were you with good people and were you at a good company?
It doesn't matter at all in startups. I don't know how much to emphasize it, but I do understand from an ego perspective how difficult it can be to let go of this idea that you may not lead something. You may not be the head or the manager of something, but it just never, in the 4 companies I've been at, it never like really mattered.
Yeah, I actually think this relates to being a founder too, but we'll come back to that later. So Instacart. So I want to actually like talk more about just Instacart itself, because I think something that people miss about any startup that works is one, in my opinion, most companies that work, the narrative is so like picture perfect by the time you're hearing about it. And it's usually told by the same people, like maybe a couple of their VCs and the founders. And so often it gets very like whitewashed. It's very like, oh, this is what it is. And it was always like this. And then if you actually go talk to someone that was there, even if that story is partially true, you miss on all these other details or all of these other things that made it work that those stories maybe don't get told. So you have this tweet. I'm actually going to read it here. It's like the deep and lasting impact that I believe Andrew Kane had on Instacart's success is relatively hidden. It's a if you know situation, thinking of all the untold stories of extraordinary early employees. And I believe you wrote this somewhere around when Instacart went public, or like maybe announced their S1, something like that. It was around the IPO. So I'm just curious, like, where was your head at when you wrote this?
Where was my head at? I think every company is built of people, and on the early employee side especially, there is superhero level of kind of work and also of imagination and contribution that people make. Because if you're the founder or founders, you're not doing everything. So actually, it ends up being a lot of the sometimes like most interesting or most impactful ideas or cultural changes come not from you directly, but from other people that you hire and hopefully empower. Andrew Kane, I believe, was the first engineer at Instacart. Super insane, cracked engineer. And one of the things that is so untold about his contribution is not his crackness of coding, like basically everything, like in the beginning. Obviously, there were other engineers too. So just to be clear, they were amazing too. But he took it upon himself to write up and like basically get Instacart to use Blazor, which is the SQL query that he wrote. It's open source. And the reason why I mentioned this such a specific thing is because since he made it so easy to query data from a very early stage, it totally made the culture of Instacart one of data democracy. And this is very important for a company where it's operational too. It's not just technology, but there's a lot of operational people like general managers, ops people like me, later on product people like me. Because if you really want to be able to justify or really understand what's going on, one piece is at least looking at metrics. And it's very limiting to always ask, hey, engineer, could you pull this metric? And I don't know if he even thought of this like immense cultural impact his like philosophy around opening this up would be, but it just made Instacart not only move faster, but I think extremely empowered. And it's the company I would say I've been at that had the most metrics understanding. And I'm not saying that's always a good thing, but like it felt like everyone kind of knew the numbers. And everyone could kind of like, if they needed to do something, they could do it themselves and not go through engineers, not like feel restricted. He even ended up like making changes around Blazor to make it even easier to query the data. Like it's not in his job description, right? But like it is just insane to me. And I think that was actually a huge part of the culture that no one talks about because it's very effusive. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm telling you, yeah, and totally. It's not easy to describe. Did that lead to tens and millions the next year? I don't know, but it definitely led in some way to fast decision making and people able to make clearer decisions, I think. And like, is that worth 10 million? Maybe that's worth 100 million of revenue. I don't know, right?
Yeah, totally.
So no one told him to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like with the things you're describing to me, what's coming to mind is like, I think this is one beef I have with just like the myth making in startups in general is that so much of whether it works or not is just like thousands of small, tiny
Yes.
decisions made into execution. Anyone that's actually done anything, it's like we love these narratives of like, I had this brilliant insight. People in tech love narratives that say they won because they were smarter than everyone else. People in tech don't necessarily love like the stories of actually being better at execution, because execution is thousands of small actions and choices on a daily basis that are often very effusive and very hard. It's very hard to tie back to like, is this the reason Instacart or whatever
Yes.
company was successful or not?
Yeah.
But that one decision and that one amount of work leads to many, many second and third order effects that are going to compound for years for that company.
And I would say one more thing is maybe you didn't know this is what it would what would happen, this data democracy empowered culture. But I think him and many of the like early senior engineers saw these signs of impact on culture and then took it as a value and philosophy to propagate it further. So as an example, quite early on, there were engineers teaching during lunch non-technical people how to write SQL. It's what you said about these small cuts around decisions. That doesn't have to happen. No one is saying, right? Like no one's saying like, now it's time for you to go teach the support team because they're like now very curious about Blazor and how to use it. No one's saying it's your job to go teach, but things bloom and good people, I guess, make kind of interesting decisions around values and philosophy too. So I would say maybe the initial decision was more utilitarian, but I do think credit to a lot of the engineers at Instacart who probably saw these more kind of effusive benefits.
Totally. I actually think even just with the culture itself, it's like, this is why the early hires matter so much.
Yes.
Because no one told this person to make this decision. But
yes,
these values get represented, and it's like you add a person to the team and there's no structure. So it's like what their values are, like how
yes.
they think and how they operate is going to lead to them making these decisions and taking these actions. And that is what's going to compound, not the like how smart you were in some document you wrote about like what your culture is going to be on day one.
Yeah. Totally. Like you could even argue, like, what if Instacart had some douchey CTO, which did not, and just heard about this and said, why, as an engineer, are you spending your lunchtime teaching support people SQL? Like, that doesn't seem worth it to me. But that was just not the culture. It was just kind of like, oh, well, I want to help my other coworkers. This seems pretty good. So, all right.
Yeah. Okay. So Instacart, you have all these experiences. You've some great stories there too. You jumped to a company called Gigster. I remember when I first met you, you described this company to me almost as like a company who was like too early. Like you almost saw what it was like to be like a little bit early to something. Because like what they're doing, I actually don't even know if what they're doing now is what they were doing then. And I feel like I will do a worse job than you will of introducing what this company did. But you jumped from Instacart to this company. So like one, what happens there? Like how did you make the jump from Instacart to this company? And then what did it do? And I guess like maybe what are some of your biggest learnings from that general experience?
The reason I went to Gigster is because I met the CTO of Gigster at a meetup at Gigster. I was not intending to apply or anything. I didn't even know what Gigster was at that meetup. But I met the CTO. He was so visionary, interesting, cool, that after the conversation, I couldn't help but think I would really like to be around him more and maybe work with him on whatever Gigster was. And so actually I ended up emailing him right after we talked. And I just said, do you have any job openings? I'm like really interested in this company. But of course that's paired with other things, right? Because I left a company. I was feeling, even those quite early at Instacart, it was like a couple hundred people at that time. I had met the CTO of Gigster. I was feeling, I wish I was seeing more, like all hands, awesome, good to see different metrics, the company strategy. But maybe I was being a little impatient, which is not good, by the way. But I felt a little impatient about, man, I would like to be in more conversations at least. Like, I don't need to be a decision maker, but I'd like to understand how the like sausage gets made more. And in my position, I don't really see a good path towards that. And so that is another reason where I just thought, well, this CTO is great. I also think I probably structurally should just try to go to a smaller company if this is like the craving, like the curiosity and empowerment type of vibe that I really want. So that was the main thing. And Gigster, why I believe it's early is because Gigster's vision was to build software for companies. And one of the best ways to build software is to automate the building of software. There was a component, which is what I ended up leading, almost like a general manager like role of a freelance network. That was like part of the vision. Like you can automate it and also use almost like fractional and contract related talent, product managers, designers, engineers to do that. But I think we were too early. It was like almost the vision was too big for where technology was.
Interesting. There's a company that I have some friends at called Contra. That it's not the exact same thing, but the network component of it is very similar. They're almost building out their own like network of this talent.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of companies going after some semblance of this today. So yeah, it's interesting. But I want to double click on the actual like reason you left. How often do you think it is that like people outgrow their roles and opportunities at companies, and then that being like why they make the jump? Because I actually think this is something people debate. Like, should you stay at a company for like a long period of time? Like there's this whole meme on Twitter of like people don't stay long enough at different companies. But then you see a lot of very entrepreneurial people, in my opinion, like you had like decent stints at all of the companies you've been at, but it's not like you stayed at Instacart from like 2013, 2015 to like IPO.
Totally.
Like you made jumps along the way.
Totally.
I'm curious, like how much of that do you think it was because you're just like, you had hit the limit on how much you were growing, and if you wanted to keep growing at the same pace, you had to go somewhere else?
Really good question. And in many ways, if I were to look back rationally, I probably left Instacart too early. I was probably too impatient. I don't think the role I was outgrowing, but I didn't feel I had champions at Instacart. And I think, therefore, I didn't feel I had the people support to be able to grow. Like, I actually felt like I was still learning in my craft because I was so young to product management too. There was so much more to do, and the surface area is actually very interesting, like the logistics and scheduling pieces. But I looked around and I didn't think I had enough like champion.
Yeah, totally. I've been having this conversation with my girlfriend because she's considering moving from finance to tech. And I think the thing you pointed out earlier is network matters a ton, like network and likelihood of success. I think after those two things, if I were to add something, it is like, who is your boss? And then more generally, like who will champion you? Yeah. I've been on both sides of that where I like did not have the right champions at a company, or the champion I had left or whatever. And then that was like game over for my career there. And then I've been on the other side where it's like, think about it. There's like an angel investor in my current company that I think back to that is I worked with. He was my boss at one point at On Deck. I don't think any of the chain of things that ended up being good for me at that company, I can kind of tie all the way back to some of the things that he did for me that I didn't even find out about till later, where he would go advocate for me to get this opportunity, or even just like he could have taken the credit for my work and he didn't. And so I think that's like underrated, as having that person that goes to bat for you and kind of looks out for your career there. Yes. Obviously, and I think it's a tough thing too, because you have to earn it somewhat, but it's also not entirely in your control either.
Yeah, and that's what I meant by I think I could have been impatient, but maybe what I saw was that I felt I could see other people being championed, and I didn't feel like I was getting as commensurate championing. And I didn't feel it was like really like the work and the quality. Like it felt like there were other things that just maybe, just to be clear, it was like never negative. It was just like quite lukewarm. And I knew actually at that time for Instacart, like the product side, product teams can often, just to be really direct, why I sometimes don't like product people in orgs, product can often be a very political place. And so I could see that. And I kind of could not really see a good, like, it's not like I didn't see a path, but it was like, oh, this is going to be very hard.
Yeah. I think that's like, we don't necessarily have to get too deep into this, but something I expected coming into startups from just all the rhetoric is startups aren't political places. I know about myself, I would die in a big company because it's so much
Yes.
politics. And I think I'm mediocre at politics at best. And so I had this expectation that there was not politics in startups, especially if things were working, because there's just like rising tide lifts all boats, right? That is totally not the case in my opinion. Even at a company where things are like working, there's like
Yes.
always politics, because even if things are up and to the right, there's only so many opportunities at a given time, and there's
Yep.
always somebody somewhat competing for like, I want this. And so it's never 100% positive sum in my opinion, or at least based on my experiences.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay. So Gigster, that CTO sounds like a very important person for you
Yes.
in your career. Like, you actually did work with this person for a while though. So, and what was like the number one takeaway from working with him? Like, what's the thing you feel like you learned the most?
His name is Debo, and I think his superpower, he has many, but one of them is empowerment. Like, he truly makes you think you are able to do anything. And then if there's a problem, why can it not be solved? And I think Kareem, who is the CTO of Ramp, also exemplifies this exact superpower as well. Nothing is really, I can't do it, like with those two. It's kind of like, why can't that happen? Or like, why can't you do it? Maybe sometimes even like, why can't you do it like by the next 2 hours? And I think that sort of mentality, there's danger to it, just to be clear. But in a startup, it's probably net positive because it makes you extend your belief of what's possible. And part of that is very empowering to yourself, right? Because that means if you're able to get that done, or you're able to like just be very creative under constraints, think things through differently, convince different people, like whatever it is, get a customer by yourself, I don't know, whatever, you should feel very empowered of like your own abilities as well. So that is, I think, just by far the biggest thing. And maybe his second superpower is just his ability to think through problems in a very clear way, always able to take many different problems where he doesn't really know anything, ask a lot of questions about the context, kind of think and be like, I think this is the most important thing that's like blocking this challenge you're having. Really learned a lot from him. And the first piece I especially take away a lot. It's just kind of like a lot of things in life are self-limiting beliefs.
Yeah. It's a lot of wisdom in that. Okay. So I actually, out of curiosity, how do you stay in touch?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Interesting. I feel like every person that's been anything remotely like that for me, like we're still in touch to this day. And I think that's the other reason why like bosses, like who your champion is or whatever matters, because that relationship will probably last a lot further beyond even just like whatever company you're at together.
Yeah, that was such a unique company, Gigster, that I stay in touch with many people, including people who reported to me. We talk, there's two of them. We talk every month.
Wow.
Yeah, we have a call.
That's really cool. Ramp, that's the next one on your journey.
Mm-hmm.
You joined there as head of BizOps, I think, or something to that effect. You joined really early too. You pretty much joined at like pre-seed inception stage. And again, like at the time, it's easy to look at that now as like, well, of course it's Ramp, but like they were like, Brex existed and was like already a unicorn and very dominant in Silicon Valley. Like they were like a huge deal. And so I think a lot of people would have told you this market, like this is over. This company has already won. Like, why does Ramp need to exist? And you've got in the notes here that the reality is that most people warned me against it. So I'm curious, like, why did you join Ramp? And why did you join despite the fact of a lot of people telling you, why would you go join this company that's going to go compete with Brex?
I had no fintech experience at that time. So I was asking anyone I knew in fintech, which was not very prominent in the Bay Area, which is where I was living, just to be clear. And everyone was saying, but haven't you seen the Brex billboards, which are everywhere at the time? Yes, I was like, yes, I did. I see Brex billboards every day. And they're like also, and they're so dominant and like, it's just like them and like Amex and whatever. So I didn't know, just to be clear, how to think about the market. Like in the end, I kind of did the same thing as I did with Instacart understanding, which was like, wow, a lot of people eat and have groceries and I understand that. And like with this one, I was a little bit more sophisticated, but I can't give credit to it. And I was just kind of like, well, companies spend money and I think there's a lot of companies and I think they spend a lot of money. So I don't think it's just going to be a few companies, although the dominant one is like Amex and these like larger corporate card companies. But the main reason why I joined was because I felt the founders had it. I felt when I met Dabo, he had it. And I don't sometimes know how to fully describe it. On American Idol, you see that a lot. Like not every winner in the beginning, one of the judges is like, you're a superstar. But there are a lot of times where whoever is a judge, just like you have the it factor. And I think Eric and Kareem, to me, had the it factor when I met and interviewed with them. So I was recommended to them because they were looking for a head of biz ops by a few of their angel investors who were living in San Francisco and knew some of the impact that I had at Gigster. And so I knew very little about them. Like they were in New York. There was nothing basically on the website except a wait list. But when I met them, I just thought they're very strategic people. They're very clever. And the second time around, so they had a company called Paribus, which sold, they still feel like they need to prove something. And that is a good sign to me because it means that you just feel there's an internal motivation. Maybe that's negative, right? Like sometimes it comes out negatively, but I still generally feel that's a positive thing because it carries you through tough times. That is the main reason. And then the other reason is because before the interview, I had researched more about Brex and I was like, okay, all these billboards, seems like there's a lot of sales going on. I could kind of read that. In my interview, I told Eric, I actually was like, if this is kind of like the same thing as Brex, I love product and I just believe product is a strategy. I just really want to work at a product-centric company. And he said, oh yeah, like that's not the issue. Like we are going to build an amazing product and also product is going to be very core to how we like build this company. And so I was like, okay, cool. Thanks for saying that. And I'll trust you. And those are the main reasons.
Interesting. There's a lot to double click on there, but it factor. Actually, I've heard you briefly talk about this before, but I'm curious, like, what do you, to the extent it's very hard to describe and it's
Very
subjective,
hard.
but to the extent that you can, what do you consider to be a factor? Like, what are some of the signs that like this person or these people, they have it?
I think what I mentioned to you about the motivation, they still felt like they need to prove themselves. Maybe part of it is like you have the dog in you, to put it in another way. And I've met a lot of founders. I've met a lot of people. I don't even feel they have the dog in them. For Eric and Kareem, I definitely felt that. Like it was very strong. They were very motivated, but they just had this like well of energy to draw from that made them want to build something very, very big. So that was, first the dog in them. And I just think the second, the it is like, they are just more strategic than other founders I've met, like one standard deviation above that. And I think what that means to me is like, sometimes there are people who just can see around the corners or see the connections between things more easily, or like they think ahead more, like 2 steps ahead. Yeah, I don't know fully how to describe it, but they both have that quality. So
Interesting.
They just think a lot bigger, but they also think ahead.
Yeah. So they like might actually just be smarter than a lot of other people. This is kind of what I'm hearing. Yeah.
They are smarter, but I also think they are more strategic too.
Is being strategic not just being smarter than other people?
You're just like, that's just like pure. No, because I think there's a lot of really highly technical people who arguably have extremely high IQ, but can't put a lot of pieces together commercially.
Yeah. That's fair. I don't know what this is either. I agree with you. I think it's like some of the smartest people I've ever worked with. I say this with love and I'm not going to call anybody out by name, but God, they work on the stupidest fucking things. They're like the worst things to work on. And it breaks your heart because they're like, They're so fucking talented and even like capable of execution. It's not even just like IQ. Yeah. It's like IQ, ability to execute, but they like spend years executing on the wrong thing and working on the wrong thing. And I to some extent have for sure been that person too. But yeah, so maybe it's like that strategicness is maybe it's a different type of smart.
Different type of smart. And it's not even street smart. It's like this sort of global kind of understanding of how to get to the end game a little bit, if I were to put it in a different way. You're choosing your battles, you're picking the games you play. It's a cleverness that's not quite the same as just pure academic intelligence.
Yeah, I didn't expect us to talk about that, but it is like, I actually almost think in some ways, if you are going to join a startup, I would be at the minimum looking for some level of that. Because I do think it's a little bit different too than like just pedigree. Because I think a lot of people in tech can raise money and get a company off the ground on pedigree. And often people with pedigree are just generally confident too, which goes well with fundraising. That's very different than having this like factor that you're talking about. That's a whole other different thing that people confuse with the first two of like confidence and pedigree and stuff like that.
Yeah. And you don't always have to have like this sort of strategic, like it can be so many things. I actually really value like the dog in them, like the hustle type people. There are a lot of really younger consumer founders I follow on Twitter. They have like very low pedigree, but you can tell they're just so experimental. I don't feel like they're strategic. Actually, they don't have like the thing that Eric and Kareem have, but they do have maybe even like this other sort of dog in them that's like different, but very admirable. And so, yeah, I think like there's many forms of it. And every time it's kind of different, but like to me, it feels kind of clear when someone has it. Yeah.
Totally. Last thing on Ramp. Generally, I feel like whenever you're at a company, especially this early, you do a lot of things. And so it's almost like hard to answer this question, but to the extent that you have an answer, just what is like a thing or the thing that you were most proud of that you accomplished during your time there?
Maybe concretely, I was the one who led the launch of the company from stealth to actually it being a thing. And it was like pretty successful launch. It established this sort of brand and positioning too around saving and being the partner to companies and really caring about companies saving money, not just like points. I know the messaging has evolved since I've left, but like, you know, there was a little bit of a narrative crafting and how to also kind of create some virality. But more, I think, is the kind of softer stuff I feel very proud of. I'm obviously just, first of all, like thankful that I even got the opportunity to be there and was hired there. But like the things that I think I had some level of impact on were putting a lot of the core practices for different operational pieces of the company together and being the first person to do them, basically write the playbook, scale them through different approaches like automation or with the engineering team and or hiring people to take that over. So that includes things like risk operations. It includes things like support. It includes things like the revenue and sales operations side, and even just how the company was starting to already plan and do goals and metrics to keep the engine going and accountable. So yeah, I'm very proud of that. And hands were in every pot, but that's like the main thing. Maybe culturally, I worked with the head of product, Jeff, quite a lot. And interestingly, we have kind of similar backgrounds, but a little bit different. Jeff is the head of product, I think, still at Ramp, and he had biz ops background. And interestingly for me, I was the head of biz ops with product background. And I think the influence of product seeping in every aspect as much as possible, including operations, was another thing I would say more culturally I was quite happy and am proud of. What I mean by that is like even more specifically, support, for example, is an opportunity to understand customers and also improve the product. But I think a more typical support person, because it's not like I was doing support before, would have just ran support as like answering questions. Whereas and with like Jeff's buy-in, and he was very like a huge advocate for it, support became a huge opportunity to mine product improvements and also just be able to get more information from customers and also opportunities to like automate a ton of different things. So maybe that's the cultural thing I'm very proud of.
A lot of good stuff there. I think one, just quickly on that launch, I've always been curious how they did this, but I feel like Ramp almost from very early on, like they're not like a traditionally heavy like marketing company necessarily, but there was this narrative from very early on that they were just like actually had a better product or were building the best product in the space, despite the fact that there was all this competition and other people. And like they were a very product driven company. It's not like the founders were like marketing gods, though I think they are pretty good at marketing, but it's like there's this narrative that got incepted that like it just kind of took off, and it has honestly been a thing to this day that I think is really impressive. And then on the product point, like having customer support and operations be more product minded is a very subtle thing. It's like we're dealing with some of this at my current company, but even you see it with other places. Like those support people, they're just like finishing tickets. They're not thinking about like, how do we actually make this thing better? Like someone whose job is customer support, they're like thinking about their job. They're not going to try to automate their job away. Whereas someone who could do multiple things, who might have a product background at the company, has no like skin in the game over like, well, what if I automate this thing that is like my main job? And yeah, it's a very non-obvious thing. And I can't even almost like fully trace it back. You go to Remote. And my perspective of Remote, and actually maybe even some of the other companies in this category too, is they're not really that way. It's super ops heavy. It's not very product driven. It's incredibly like a lot of mechanical Turk going on. Like talk to what you feel comfortable talking to there. But how much of that insight actually came from being at a place in an industry where there was actually a lot of just like ops driven, just to get this stuff done, not necessarily being very product driven?
Well, I think it's pretty public because Parker Conrad from Rippling has talked about how operationally driven HR companies are, and like, you know, his thesis of automating things while also compounding the startup. But one thing is, I didn't realize he made these interviews after I joined Remote, and I did not really know, to be clear, an HRIS company, despite the software interface, is so operationally intensive. And this includes HRIS. Remote includes like payroll, contractors, and like PEO essentially, or like employer of record more specifically. One thing I would say about Remote is that what's really hard when you build a compound startup is that it becomes the easiest and fastest thing to do is to start hiring more people. And especially when you have the complication of more countries, more localities, like more specialties within like legal, that, you know, someone should answer these questions. That becomes kind of like the easiest avenue to access. Like, oh, we raised a lot of money. Now it's time to hire the Spanish ops person, the like British payroll person. And if one doesn't like observe this very closely or monitor it closely, it like kind of gets away from the company. And so I would say one of the challenges I had at Remote, and like Remote is a really good company, but one of the things Remote, Deal, Rippling all have to face is exactly that sort of ability to get the scaffold of the baseline of certain operations, see how to automate things or templatize things, and then what else is additional and needed. Like, I think that is just a very, very tough challenge for all of the companies, Remote included, just to be clear. And as a product person, I spent a lot of time on internal automations and admin to support our operations teams. But all of these companies face the same problem. And because it's so competitive and there was so much money thrown at all three of these companies, they had to grow, right? Like very fast to support their customers. That's what happens. Like it kind of just like balloons, and let's see like if it gets away from any of the companies. Because the key to success is that you don't keep scaling the number of people in ops with the number of companies that you have and the amount of revenue you have.
Interesting. Okay, so a couple like double clicks there. One, just I guess this is like more of a comment. Like I think the space I'm in now, like a lot of companies face this, and in any of these spaces where you're touching the real world and there's some kind of like a compliance type companies suffer from this a lot. It is very easy to get off the ground with a mechanical Turk, like a thing where part of your product is mechanical Turk, part of your product is ops driven, and you can tell the narrative of like, we're going to automate it later. And it's very easy to get off the ground and still deliver a great experience to your customer this way. And then that like, but as you scale, that becomes so hard to keep doing without it just becoming like a human driven thing. And you essentially being like more ops or more tech enabled, whatever, versus product. So I guess you had a comment here, controversial opinion. If you want to automate, create change, it's better to take a smart first principled person for someone with deep domain experience. Double click on that.
You already hinted at it when we talked about support, where I mentioned my experience at Ramp, because I'm not a traditional support person, even though I did like personally 50% of the tickets or something, like by the time I had left. Because of that, I'm very incentivized to automate my own job, or I have no ego around it, right? It's just kind of like, got to get outcomes, it's not about my role. And so I think there's a few things about creating change, and especially internal admin automation is the first thing that you hit the nail on the head on, which is there is a little bit of insecurity job wise when you're trying to automate someone's domain area. And like, let's say you have 3 payroll operations folks, I was leading payroll product, and you're trying to like automate things. That can seem very, very uncomfortable if it's not really aligned around even with that leadership on the ops side. It's like, oh, well, I kind of, for some managers, like, I want a big team. Well, automating things might mean you're not hiring as much. So I think there's just a cleaner separation when you kind of have someone who's less tied in skin in the game around the position, even though they do need to get the domain expertise somehow. And that's like a whole separate kind of conversation. But the second thing is, I have found time and again that with specific domains, especially in ops, you can kind of get information about, hey, this is what I'm doing every day, blah, 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 blah. But actually, you should not be asking, right, like how someone would change their role because they don't know how. They're so ingrained. And so like I think it's a mistake, but maybe it's just I haven't seen it work out in the companies I've been at. People who are the domain managers or domain expertise, like leading the change for automation, like proposing the ideas instead of a more third-party person. And that, I think, leads to just a lack of ability to rethink things from the bottoms up because they're so immersed in this is the way, I don't know, in your case, like tax compliance has been done for like 50 years. Like this is the way it's done. And the point about automation is that it's not about the way it's done. It's about like getting to a better outcome.
Totally. Yeah. The recent manifestation of this for us is we're looking at recruiting again, adding more to our team. And one danger of recruiting from companies that have been in this space in the past is they have their way of doing things. And often if they were there too long, and this can be true for almost any domain where someone is part of even something successful in a certain space, if they've been there too long, they almost just like, this is the way they do things. And they can be very unlikely to want to do it any other way because they just can't get this like, well, this is the way we always did it here. And this is the way it should be done. And so if you're trying to do something net new, it's almost like those are on paper, those can seem like the people to hire. And in reality, they can be the worst people to hire.
Yes. Yeah. This is the way it should be done is pretty crazy because this is a new company and likely your company is trying to change the way things were done. And so the problem though is like you do need domain expertise to give some guidance and make sure you're like not fully off the rails. I wouldn't personally believe like for creating change or something new, they are the people who lead. They are definitely the people who give and provide input, but that's it. Like that's kind of, we'll work together, but it's not really about your direction. Yeah.
My last comment on this is I think part of it too, and this is like why the foundation matters so much, is the right incentive alignment. Because the problem is if you have these like power centers or just like groups of people that have their own set of incentives as the company grows that are different than the company's specific incentives. So for instance, if you have like an ops team and your plan is to always automate this function, but then you have a huge amount of people in your company that are that function, you're trying to automate it, like your company goal, and like all of a sudden you've got all of this misalignment from like the macro company level to all these different micro pieces of the company underneath. And it's just like, not that you can't overcome it, but it's very difficult to overcome that incentive misalignment. And at the minimum, it's going to cause a lot of internal chaos from what I've seen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like we could keep going there, but for sake of time, want to make sure we talk about some of the things you've written about. Because as we've been going through your entire background, I'm starting to see like, okay, this is some of like what informed this piece. So I'm going to like read off a couple quotes and then let you just talk more about the topic. My favorite one, actually, I send people this a lot.
Oh, cool.
Is
Thank you.
The sun. Yeah. I think this is my personal favorite of everything you've written. Because it's like one of those things where you read something and you're like, someone just articulated something that I knew that I didn't know that I knew. It's just like you put to words something that I'd experienced, but I'd never like heard articulated before. And so recommend anybody listening to go read this piece, and we'll put it in the show notes. But when you're working at a startup, pay attention to the company's sun. What are the 1 to 2 functions that have a disproportionately large influence on calling the shots? The sun is always derived from the founders, their biases, experiences, what they're good at. In the best case, founders take an unabashed and authentic stance around where power lies. In the worst case, founders are half-assed about the identity of the company.
Well, it actually directly relates to what we were talking about right before on the operational side. So there's many companies, I've been at several, where there's a big ops component and then there's product engineering design. And those are often where I've seen the most tension. But there are also, I understand like SaaS companies where maybe the core tension is actually sales and then like product or engineering. But specifically the first case, what we were talking about, a few things. So first is you can really let your company kind of go as founders if you don't almost like emphasize what team matters more, or like what approach, as I call it, like the sun matters more. And in the case of ops oriented companies, like tech enabled services companies, often it can kind of get, as we talked about, potentially out of hand. You're hiring more and more ops people. That's the way to address things. You don't take the time to start automating in these alignment tensions that you mentioned between maybe like the VP of ops and the VP of product. Like the ops person is kind of dominating, but really the founders are saying they're like engineering oriented in their tech company. So it kind of doesn't align. So the VP of product is like, wait, that's not what the founders want. But then the VP of ops is like, whatever, that's like not really my understanding. So everything you mentioned about that tension, especially around alignment, is why I wrote, as someone who had been at just like pure software companies, the sun, because I saw in many of the companies I was at potential times where the founders wanted one thing. Usually in Silicon Valley, it's like product and engineering. And what really ended up driving decisions was not product and engineering. And maybe I'm sensitive to it because I often have been in the product team, but sometimes I've been the ops side too. But I'm more of a product person. So I feel like I more resonate with that side in general. And that's what I meant. At worst, actually, it's not taking the stance. It's never, in my experience, the founders are too clear. Like they're so opinionated. It's like engineering is dominant. Like, product matters more. It's actually this sort of like quiet disappearingness, letting everyone else adjudicate, but actually there's no real alignment. And what needs to happen is the founders very clearly saying, this matters more. Like this is
Totally.
the sun.
Totally.
And it's very hard. And in the essay, I also write, it's not an easy thing to say, right? Because like you're almost saying you are more powerful and therefore you are less powerful. But the thing is, it provides immense clarity and actually it gets people on board in a better and clearer way who agree with your approach.
Yeah. One, I love this. I think a great example that you actually wrote down is like Brex being very sales driven and Bramp being very product driven. But I actually have to give you credit because ever since I read this last summer, probably, I think this is the first time I read this. It's just like you basically gave a meme to like, or an idea to the thing that I'd felt. We were recruiting our head of tax. We poached him from elsewhere and I was in his home and I asked him a question and I basically articulated, is the company you're at right now sales driven? And I just like asked him that question and I basically described your idea. My friend wrote this piece. It basically says this.
Yeah.
I suspect your current company is sales driven. Am I wrong about that? Am I right about that? Like, just tell me. And he actually told me later after we hired him, that was like the moment he decided he was going to join because for whatever, I don't know why that specific thing resonated. Part of it is like what we were trying to do that was like different than where he was at currently. But yeah, so I actually kind of like, you articulating that actually had a lot of impact on clarifying my own thinking. So,
oh my God, I'm so happy. I'm so happy because this sort of essay and why I like your podcast is it's just the only way you can kind of like start thinking about this and articulating it is if you operate at a company. Like there's no way you can like kind of read essays and then come to this sort of feeling about the dynamics And one thing I will like ask you about for your head of tax, was it that you all are more product driven and like that's what you want to focus on? Whereas like his previous company, he felt it was just like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
see.
that was like essentially it. Is he was at a competitor. He actually approached us, so we weren't like doing the
Hmm.
traditional poaching thing. But I knew who he was by reputation. He's been in our industry for a long time and is very respected. And I had a suspicion around like I knew he was interested in leaving. It was very delicate because for him, if you're at a direct competitor to another
Yes,
company and you're looking at leaving, it's just sensitive because one, like the fact that if they found out you were recruiting, that could like cost you your job no matter what.
totally.
But then two, if they find out you're recruiting at a direct competitor, it's like game over. So there was a lot of sensitivity to it. So I was trying to understand what his motivations were, and it was just a sensitive situation. But part of it is like I had my own suspicions about this company, and so
Yeah.
I was trying to understand like that was my suspicion based on everything I understood about them. Is I felt that they were extremely sales driven based on how they had like put their team together and based on like some reading between the lines of some of what he had
Yes.
said to me before. Honestly, he's more of a product person than like he's not like a do compliance work person. Like he's in some ways almost like closer to a head of product in terms of how he functions at our company than just like doing tax stuff. And so product was very important for how we were going to do everything. It's very important to him. And so just like kind of like trying to understand where he was coming from is why I asked that question. And I think it resonated with him because he was looking for like trying to understand. Like I think for him, the way he told it to me is that the fact that I even understood that about why they were doing things they were doing, I guess made him think that I at least wasn't a complete idiot maybe. And
Yeah,
then I think for
totally.
him also the conversation that followed after that was that like, okay, this is why we are architecting our team this way, not this way right now
Yeah.
for these reasons. And I think the great thing about your essay is that if you read this and it resonates with you and your experiences, it almost like gives you permission to call it out. And I think for us, like this is inevitable. Every company I've been
Yeah.
at, this happened. No one ever called
Yes.
it out, but this just was very much a thing.
Yeah.
Like there was a function or two that dominated. And I actually do think it's like valuable, even so we're going to talk in a second about like being a founder. I think it's valuable if you're starting a company to actually think through like, in this business that I'm potentially starting, this product I want to build, like what, as you construct your team, your co-founders, like everything, like what do I want the sun to be? What do I think it needs to be?
Yeah.
What do I think winning looks like? And I don't think Ramp, to your point, like Kareem and Eric have been just, I don't know, like sales bros. I don't know if that would have worked. If that was like their background and who they were as people, I don't know if that company succeeds because Brex already was so good there.
So good there. Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think this matters in like who you hire, how you recruit, but even like co-founders. Like I think even like who you choose as your co-founder, like for me being non-technical, if I wanted to have an extremely high engineering centric company, we were like excellent and world class at engineering. I don't think I as a solo founder or like working with another non-technical co-founder, for instance, could do that because we would not have that DNA at the core of our company. I think it's such a like simple insight, but it's also very profound because people are not intentional about it very often. They don't explicitly talk about it. It's almost like no one calls it out and no one's even thinking of it this way.
They're not intentional. And then I sometimes think founders are pretty aware, just to be clear. I think founders are quite smart and kind of can see things. And my other point is, I think sometimes people are fearful of making things clear on the founder side.
Interesting.
Because it means you're taking a stance. It means you're putting a stake in the ground. And even though that often leads to better results, right? Like the more people understand what you are, actually, that often is better. But you fear that you're offending a lot of people.
Yeah. I think this is a great transition into like, you've done all of these companies. You've been in product, you've been in ops. I mean, you've had like an incredible career working in startups. And now you're a founder. Honestly, you could have very much like kept on this, like a lot of people get into that run of like being a early to mid stage like person at a company when it's like scaling or getting off the ground or whatever. And you could have very much kept going down that path. You were already very successful at it. You chose to start a company instead. And I think a lot of people think of doing this too, getting some experience and then eventually going and like taking their own swing. So I'm just curious, like what your experience has been with like switching from one side to the other. And I don't even have this question written down, but I kind of feel like you hinted on it earlier. Why if I'm totally wrong about this, tell me, but it feels like confidence and maybe or maybe not imposter syndrome was also a piece of this for you, like building your own confidence before becoming a founder.
Yeah.
How important is like having the confidence to feel like you were ready then to you ultimately deciding to take the leap?
I think when someone wants to start a company, because now we both know it's so hard, But when someone like just has the inkling of wanting to start a company, it's not, oh, like last week was the first time I thought about it. This sort of idea had been brewing in my mind for years since I was in San Francisco, which sometimes is not a good influence because founders are definitely put on a pedestal. So maybe in some ways I was indoctrinated with this idea of like, okay, the only next step is to be a founder. But just to be clear, I had thought about this like, could I try to start my own thing for many years? The reason why I want to start a company and I want to be a founder is I think it's just the biggest way you can create like impact on the commercial side. I was early at multiple companies and I was luckily afforded quite a lot of responsibility. So I really think, especially Gigster and the folks at Ramp, but you're still not fully in control and you're not fully, therefore, the flip side, the bad side is responsible for the breadth of the outcome. And so I just craved that. And I wanted that sort of impact and just like life experience, if I were to be honest. The confidence piece played a huge role into it. And I wonder if that often deters more women from becoming founders too. I think actually when I look at people who go into founding companies, they're much younger. It's not the average age I know of like successful companies, like 42, whatever, but like the number of people I see going into becoming founders, they're usually quite young. I'm 31 and they're usually like a 24, like whatever, not very much work experience. I felt, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever it is, there was almost like nothing, there wasn't more left for me to like really give that as an excuse anymore of founding something. Because, you know, every company I thought, well, Instacart, that one I wouldn't say like was an excuse, but like, oh, I need to go to a smaller company. And then like after Gigster, I'm now have become a manager, a decent title, but now, you know, I need to like be the head or like lead and like even younger company. And like you start running out of excuses after that. Like what's next? And so, yeah, I think if I were more confident, I probably would have started something earlier, but I have no regrets because there's actually also positive things from accumulating background and experience.
Totally.
And one of them, by the way, is not even skill set. It's just like emotional endurance. Like I have just been through so much crap at the startups. And I'm sure you have, like, and when it's early, you just, even as an employee, but especially early, you go through a lot and you're working a lot and you're just emotionally drained. So I was like, this is just a continuation.
Yeah.
It's not like super new, the emotional part.
Yeah. It's also a great segue. You keep setting me up so well. You have something written down here on like what's been the hardest thing about transitioning, and you wrote down the idea maze is terrible in all caps. And I think that if you've been early and you've been at some level of scale, and definitely you've like seen pretty much every angle I think you could of a startup from like zero pre-MF and not even being launched to being at like material scale and product market fit. That like -1 to even just like 0 and maybe a little bit past 0 is something that you often don't see as even if you were there before full-blown PMF, you don't see the -1 and you can't really prepare for that. And so I'm curious, like you clearly have like had experiences with that. Like why is it so terrible?
Wait, let me ask you first. Do you think it's terrible in all caps, the idea maze? Oh,
I have
you don't
fantasies.
I do. Okay.
Yeah. I don't think I feel as strongly. I think it sucks in a lot of ways. I also think I'm like, God, the first 6 months of last year were some of the hardest of my life. I've been through some fucking hard times. So like they were hard in a different way than other things I'd been through before. Just the immense amount of uncertainty I was constantly grappling with was definitely very difficult. And it's just like when you feel you're mentally like working so hard and trying to like figure something out. And if you feel any kind of time pressure to figure something out, because it's like if you're in tech and you leave whatever job you have to go start a company and you're working on that full time, but you don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
For maybe a little bit, you get some support, but like basically going through the idea maze, you just feel like an idiot because you're just constantly like moving from idea to idea. Like you could spend literally a year there with nothing to show for it. And eventually it's also like, you feel like, what if I lose all the support of all these people if I can't come up with something good to work on? And you fall in love and out of love with ideas many times. So it's definitely hard. I also walked away from that feeling like, man, I think this would be so much easier if I was a second time founder and like not worried about the financial side of this, had more success. Cause then you could almost like have more fun with it because you like have confidence in
You're
that you'll
looser.
get there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I felt very uptight during a lot of my
Yeah.
process. And so I think I have no clue. Ask me in like 10 years if that's like true or something. But my experience of it was very hard and I enjoyed it a lot less than I thought I would. And I was very happy when I was on the other side of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's immensely hard. And I do think everything what you said, it triggers me because I think it's terrible. But I was going to say, even without you saying it, the idea maze, because I am also a first-time founder, I also was uptight about the whole process. It made me feel like a complete loser because for so long, I also didn't have a co-founder. I was co-founder dating. So I had no anchor in that way. Then you're revolving around all these ideas where you're kind of like doing interviews, you're doing cold outreach on LinkedIn, if you're, especially on the B2B side. And every day you can kind of convince yourself in and out of whether some problem spaces make sense or not. Like it's so existentially open. And what I guess think the analogy is like, even if you're early, you just don't see this part, is like, it's almost like when you're early at a company and you're not the founders, you still have been given the seed. Like the seed was picked out and maybe even the place, and you got to kind of like do things and like maybe grow it. But like when you're a founder in this -1 or negative infinity space, you don't even know where you are. You could be at the desert, you can be in the beach, like you could plant a flower, like seed, you could like do this and that, like everything, the degrees of freedom are so open. I feel that's why it's so hard. And it's very lonely. I met you through the idea maze, like both of our idea mazes. And the thing that did keep me going was other founders, to be really like clear. It's unfortunate you were also an employee, but unfortunately, like other employees, like they don't really help because it's only like founders who understand this journey. And then what kept me going was, I guess, like the internal motivation to try to, like, as a life journey thing, start a company for the first time and just like commit and say, hey, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but I really want to see it through and then I will have peace of mind. But those were very difficult things to anchor around the journey. And the last thing I would say about the idea maze, like you mentioned the second time founder going through it and becoming just less uptight. The area that I'm working in, I'm building a consumer AI product, is not at all where I was looking for the first 9 months and what I thought I would be working on. I thought I would only be working on B2B stuff, given my experience. And I think it's out of desperation where I thought, you know what, if I'm not tied to particular problem space or industry, I'm just going to open the aperture. Like the world is the oyster. I could start a coffee shop. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like anything. It doesn't even have to be like consumer product. It's just like anything. And I actually think that desperation made me more loose. And that actually gave me the freedom to like truly see interesting opportunities.
Yeah.
So if I were to go back, that's kind of what I would like tell myself. Well, first of all, I should just try to like find all the co-founder potentials. Like I just didn't do that when I left Remote. I was not strategic or savvy about it. Should have like lined up all these people. That could have been helpful. But I think it would have been like, be a little bit more loose. It's definitely going to be nonlinear.
Yeah. Yeah. It's extremely nonlinear. And I actually think that's one thing that makes it hard about coming out of like working at a startup is while startups are themselves not necessarily linear, there's enough structure still in terms of like how you can talk about your career. Like you still have a job, you still have a thing you're working on. Like there's enough there that it is easier. And I think it is one of the most non-linear things you will ever do in your life. And I think that's part of what makes it hard. And the thing that came to mind when you were talking through that is like, it is almost like going through the fall per se. That's like the term that was coming to mind is like when you go through something where it's like, you almost like your ego dies a little bit, maybe not forever, but your ego gets damaged and like really cut. And yeah, like I think in a different way, definitely went through that myself and have been through that in other contexts. But the good thing about that is when you're on the other side of it, it almost does like you're just like freer because it's like, well, I've gone through all this versus like if you had like just jumped out and told people, if you had been on your way out of remote telling people I'm going to start a consumer Gen AI company, people would have probably looked at you like you had like two heads or something. Most people.
Totally. Man, there's so much to say about the idea maze, but yeah, I think it was quite terrible. No regrets, but I guess to anyone listening, it's hard for everyone. Like you mentioned the second time thing, I actually through this process tried to talk to many multi-time founders to get in their mind, because I was kind of like, oh, if I talk to them, like they can transplant their juices into me and like, yeah, idea maze. I actually have heard it doesn't get that much easier, even the second and third time around. Like I think it does, like in some ways, but it sounds like it's still very tough.
Yeah. Well, and also there's like the challenges of if you're a second time founder and the first one worked to any degree, there's like a whole other set of challenges that will also happen with that. So it's like, yeah, there's probably not easy on either side of it, but I at least like to tell myself that if there is a next time, it will be much easier.
Yes. Keep up the copium.
God, I love that. Copium. I'm going to steal that.
I'm learning Gen Z terms these days. So
yeah, well, you're in consumer. You've got to know the Gen Z terms now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. My last major question for you on today's podcast is you talked about it a little bit, but it took you longer than the average person to have the confidence to be a founder. One, you said it's a controversial take. Why do you think that's controversial? And just generally, like, what's your takeaway from being on the other side of this now?
I think it's like controversial of like Silicon Valley rewards and historically has been about bravado and people who like, just do it. They really take the extreme risk. Like they have the idea, they're going to go for it and like all in. And I think seeing that, maybe knowing that like my profile was, I had brewed for a while, for so long, I wanted to start a company. The motivation has just like not decreased. And I had to build confidence, I guess might make it seem like I'm not as fit of that narrative, I guess, is kind of what I meant, to be a founder for a big company. And my other side, again, maybe this is copium too, of just seeing actually older and multi-time founders more in action, is that there's a lot that you get from experience where you start shooting like directionally more accurately. And what I mean by that is like, I actually think a startup's most important trait is velocity. Velocity is composed of speed, which most people in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, emphasize. Like, do things fast, ship things fast. But velocity is speed and direction. And if you're just kind of super young, you're so high energy, eager, but you're doing a lot of activity, but they're kind of like dispersed and not in really the kind of like right area, that's actually not velocity either. So maybe my controversial take is, kind of copium of, because I've been in like a bit more situations, I don't think I've like lost a dog in me. I do think I have less energy than a 20-year-old. Like I just have to sleep more. Like I can't hang as much. I can't like drink and then also just like keep on working. But I think I have better judgment, see around corners better, and like can create leverage like better and like know directionally how things go. And maybe that's like as good for the velocity standpoint as possible. So yeah, that's like what I would say to that.
Yeah. I love that. Maybe this isn't my own copium, but I think there's like a lot of, I don't even think lies are the right thing, but I think we learn a lot of the wrong lessons from why things work. And actually, Peter Thiel almost talks about this, and this side of 0 to 1 doesn't get talked about enough, but it's like people take away like the wrong idea from like the next Facebook won't be Facebook. And people take that analogy with the company, specifically like the idea. I don't think people take that with the individuals themselves and their own backgrounds and things like that, because I think I've studied enough people that did go on to be very successful or even just met them that had their narratives are either just not talked about as much. And so people don't realize that they like defy a lot of these things that people say of what a successful founder looks like. Yeah. Or if the narrative is out there, the narrative is wrong. And so, or it's like, it's leaving out part of the truth. And maybe this is my own copium because I've had to my entire career. Here and there's a couple traits, but a lot of things about me have not felt like I was supposed to be what I felt like I should be if I wanted to do the things I've had ambitions about. And so I've always struggled with that. And so I've looked for like, well, is there any proof at all? Or am I just like wasting my time? And so I think maybe this is copium, we'll see. But I think the finding more of these people who defy this narrative and then just like realizing that has just kind of made me like think there's so many fucking ways that people can win. Like, yes, there are truths, but the idea that there's like the perfect background of like whatever success is supposed to look like, I think is just something that it's wrong, because all it takes is like one. I actually don't even think like the Mark Zuckerberg narrative was like the thing, because if you go back far enough in Silicon Valley history, most of the founders were like very seasoned, very experienced, and like decades of the entire semiconductor era. All of the successful founders from that era, with the exception of maybe the Fairchild folks, but even they had experience. All of them were started by very experienced operators, almost no like college dropout type founders. So I think there's just like, it's not even the takeaway isn't have like experience. You need to have that. The takeaway is these things are almost like so unlikely to begin with that I don't think there is an archetype that is unilaterally true. And for me, at least, that's given me a little bit more freedom to stop fucking caring about whatever people say success is supposed to look like. It doesn't really matter.
That. I love it. It's very motivating, because I think what I've learned through this, starting this company, is actually when I lean into who I am and the weird things about me or the strengths, and like, cancel out the noise of society or whatever else. That's the way it's like things have been more successful. So also, the term founder, I never saw myself as a founder. I really wanted to do it. And the poster in the back is Virgil Abloh. One thing I love about him and why I'm very inspired by him is like, he has this talk where he says, I just don't like nouns, like positions, like designer, founder, whatever. Like, I just do things. Like, I write, I paint. He's like, I make clothes. I don't put myself into these like boxes. And I think maybe part of my confidence was like, oh, I don't see myself as what society, like the Bay Area says is a founder. Therefore, I'm not a founder. But you know what? In the end, it doesn't matter. I just want to build things that create value and, that people want. And like, that's good enough. And that is what equates to being an entrepreneur in this case. So yeah, I resonate with everything you said.
Yeah, I love that so much. Okay, so maybe towards like wrapping, you have a few places people should go check you out on the internet. One of them is a games podcast. So just like real quick, especially too, I do think there'll be a decent amount of B2B folks because tech has got a lot of B2B right now. Why should if someone's in B2B ask, or even consumer and asking themselves, why should I care about a podcast on games? Or what's your answer?
Because games are a really good framework to think about anything where there's like people, let's call it agents, anything where there's incentives, and then there's just like an environment that wraps around these things. And like one thing in B2B, for example, that you can think of is I had to learn this at Gigster because I did not know what sales was, and then enterprise sales. When you are trying to convince someone in a company to buy something, like let's say they're not the CEO or like the decision maker, they have to go ask their boss, or they may have to get buy-in from other people. And like, do they have a relationship with those other teams? Like, what's their relationship to their boss even? And like, is their boss close to the CEO, or does the boss have power? And I know it's a very specific example, but I think games start helping you to break down many sorts of kind of like pieces of just anything. And for example, like the sales process, why is it hard to close a sale? Like what goes into it? What is the psychology of it? I find that to actually be quite game-like, because in enterprise B2B especially, but like, B2B in general, you are not a consumer who likes something and whips out your credit card. There is much more of a game on the other side someone has to play. And maybe part of your role then is to help them play the game easily, like not just create value, which is like very, very important, but like solve a problem, but like maybe you gotta like, make it easier.
It's all a game. It's on some level, it's all a game. That actually could be like a great podcast episode to do. But anyway, so where should people go for this game? Where should people go to follow your writing? Because you do have great writing, and then social media, like all the stuff, like where should people find you?
The game is called Game of Life Podcast, which is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere. And it's an allusion to or reference to Conway's Game of Life. So if anyone picks that up, that's just like a nerdy thing. And then Twitter, I'm on Twitter, like at Soph, SOPHDENG. And in my bio, I have the link, which is a GitHub link to my website. I will be writing more, and you've inspired me, Andrew, to write more, because the fact that you read it, the essays, and have shared it with people is very motivating. I really wasn't sure if people were reading these things. It was more for me, but I feel very happy, I guess, that more people have found use in the writing. So I'm going to write more. Watch out for it.
Oh yeah, that makes me excited to hear. We will share all of that stuff in the show notes. So if you are listening to this, you can just go down there and click into it. And with that, that's the pod. Thank you for coming, Sophia.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for listening to the Operators Only podcast. We put a lot of work into this. So if you're on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever, hit like and subscribe, hit follow, leave a 5-star review. Makes me feel like it's not just my mom and my girlfriend that listen to this. And most importantly, please DM me any ideas that you have for how to make the show better, new guests that we should have on, new formats. I'm all ears to everything. We're trying to make this better. So if you have ideas, find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever platform and hit me up. I want to hear how you think we can make this better. And with that, I'll see you next time.